Well, welcome everybody to ARCI's video meeting number 18. Here we are in the middle of January. We've got a little snow on the ground here. And
okay, so hopefully you're seeing my we're on YouTube screen. And most of you already know this, so I'll just be brief. We do record these meetings for presentation on YouTube to allow mainly the club members or anybody else who's interested to see them. But it does allow the whole internet to see them if they're interested. So please keep that in mind when you're speaking or sharing your materials, that anything you say or show is going to be available to the internet. Please stay on mute if you're not presenting, and pay particular attention to copyrighted materials. So YouTube has an automated feature to listen for music and to identify whether somebody has a copyright on it. And if they do, then it goes as a strike against their video and becomes a problem. So if you're sharing a radio that you restored and you're demonstrating it, please keep it off a music station.
I'd like to get the presentation section going here. And before that, Matt usually runs a poll on whether you're going to be doing a show and tell today. And our first presenter, Norm Smith, is a first-time presenter to these video meets. And Norm is a longtime collector, and he's also an author of some great books on transistor radios, which many of you have probably come across. And Norm is an expert on transistor radios, and today he's going to talk about the Zenith 500, the Royal 500. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Norm.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it is my first time to even be on Zoom other than to practice this one sometime. So I say the computer thing is all new to me. I'm an old AM radio guy, never got into computers very heavy. Anyway, the Zenith Royal 500, making the best better. The first transistor radio that was available for sale was the Regency TR1. It was released in October of 1954. It sold for $49.95, which was quite a bit of money, but it was a brand new technology. By 1955, most manufacturers tried to get into the transistor radio business. Transistor radios were new, exciting technology. Top 40 music stations were becoming very popular with the baby boomer generation, and the transistor radio made it possible to have your music with you wherever you went. This all led to explosive sales of these radios. Most were 4 or 5 transistor radios and offered marginal performance. Late in the year of 1955, Zenith released their new 7-transistor Royal 500. It was produced on a hand-wired aluminum chassis with plug-in transistors. The radio was priced at $75. Think about that. That's over $750 of today's money for a pocketable AM transistor radio. But new technology, and people were willing to pay back then for a quality product. This is the dealer specification sheet. These were sent to dealers to show the new products, and they featured a nice photo with the technical specifications of the radio. It also showed you the various colors of the cabinets that they had available. This DuPont trade industry ad featured a new nylon material that was used to make the cabinets for the Royal 500. Zenith spared no expense on the quality of materials used to manufacture the Royal 500, from the cabinet to all of the hardware used, and every other part was well made. Zenith even manufactured and wound their own coils and transformers in-house. And what that allowed them to do was to design that radio engineering-wise where they got everything they wanted. They didn't go to a generic supplier for IF cans or RF transformers. They did it themselves, and that's why their radios performed so well. Their engineering was top-notch. This is a dealer countertop display. It shows several colors of that new Royal 500. They had these in a case like that so they could display the radio without worrying about theft. They'd had it on the countertop at the dealerships. And you can see they had a very, very attractive radio. If you look at the materials that were used to this very day, and we're 60 years later, the bright metal is still bright and beautiful if it wasn't abused. And the nylon still looks like new, again, if it was taken care of. This dealer countertop displays the next generation, the second generation. If you will look close, you'll see they made some changes in that radio. Again, making the best better. They went to a printed circuit board as far as the construction was gone, which made assembling the radio much easier. Also, they went to Veneer tuning, which made separating stations much easier. With the direct drive tuning, it was hard to narrow in on a station, but with that Veneer tuning, there was a ball bearing Veneer tuning. It made it much easier. Again, improvements. This was a major step forward. Another Zenith spec sheet, 1958. This was the Royal 500D. And if you'll notice, it says Zenith long distance on that radio. They added an 8th transistor with an RF stage, which gave them about 300% increase in sensitivity. This was a radio that they really did a lot of work with. I'm going to show you what they did. This is called an inverted cone speaker. If I can, let's see, I don't know if I can do that or not. We'll talk about that later when we do show and tell. They had an inverted cone speaker that they used on some of these. And they were trying to improve the tone quality. One of the big complaints that people had about any small transistor radio in that day was that the tone quality wasn't very good. Zenith worked very hard to make major improvements in this and succeeded very well. Again, this is advertising for the Royal 500D and making the best better. And it basically describes many of the things that they did to improve that product. This was a poster that you could have from Zenith. This is what the dealers got. They could have posters made this size, this style, that they could put out there to advertise the product. And if you look at it, you'll also notice some other radios. The new Transoceanic, which was the Royal 1000, the Royal 750 next to it, the Royal 700, and the Royal 300. So they had quite a lineup of radios. But in the compact portables, the Royal 500 was top of the line. This is more Zenith advertising for the Royal 500D. A great new Zenith radio for outdoorsmen. They were really pushing the fact that these radios had this sensitivity that would allow them to work where many other radios couldn't pick up anything. You could have many stations to choose from with that extra sensitivity provided by these Zenith radios. They really were great radios. In 1959, Zenith came out with the Royal 500E. This is the spec sheet for that. As you can see, the styling was changed considerably, although the chassis was basically the same. But they just refreshed the outside look of it. They'd been using that other style for, 4 years now, and it was time to give it a little different look. 1961. This is where things really, really changed for the better. Zenith had spent a lot of effort back at the time when transistor radios were a profitable item. They put a whole lot of research and development into the Royal 500H. As you can see, totally redesigned, new cabinet, and you can also see they featured a 3x5 speaker in this radio, which was a huge speaker for a pocketable radio. If you also look a little bit closer, and we'll look at it in the next slide, on this extended range speaker, it was an off-center voice coil, and we'll get into that in a minute. One of the other major changes with this radio is they had 4 tuned IF circuits. Most radios only have 2. With that, in addition to that increased sensitivity, they also had great selectivity. And so you were able to really separate stations. If you were near a strong station, say if you were in Chicago and WGN on 720 was there blasting you with 50,000 watts, you could still listen to WLW in Cincinnati at 700 on the dial without any splashover. The selectivity on these radios is phenomenal. This features that speaker, the all-new Zenith Royal 500 Deluxe with the extended range speaker. And if you look close on the right-hand side, you can see how that speaker was laid out. There was no resonant point on that speaker due to the fact that it had that elliptical layout with the voice coil being off center. It was also one of the first consumer products to ever be produced with a ceramic magnet type technology. That's in common use for nearly everything today, but they were leaders in that and spent a lot of money to do it. They also, the cabinets on the 500H were designed. Zenith had obviously a lot of experience with hi-fi, stereo, and their hearing aid development also. So they had some audio engineers that really knew what they were doing. One of the problems that every radio can have is a resonant point in the cabinet. They worked very hard to reduce that. On the Royal 500H, if you look closely at the cabinet, there aren't any flat surfaces. It's actually a slightly rounded back. It's also vented very well so that the speaker can really breathe. That gave it a very transparent sound. The fidelity on a 500H is phenomenal to this day. There again, this was one of those poster sheets that the dealer could have made to advertise that radio. Notice what they were really pushing was that speaker because they had spent a lot of engineering and research in designing that. This is a full page dealer ad from Holiday and Esquire magazines. Again, notice what they were pushing, the fact that they had this room-sized sound from a pocket radio, and they really did. This is another ad. This was for Christmas. And it just shows what a nice radio. Boy, wouldn't that have been a great thing to get for a Christmas present? I wish I had. This is 1964. 1964, it's a beautiful radio, styling-wise. Unfortunately, it's not a beautiful radio performance-wise. Still 8 transistors, nonetheless. The tuning became very crude, very hard to tune. They went from the 350 milliwatts that was delivered by the Royal 500H back to 100 milliwatts of audio output and the small little speaker that was used just like in the early Royal 500s. Also, the cabinet was no longer nylon. They weren't willing to spend the money for that. It's a material called Cycolac, and it wasn't very good. These radios have not stood the test of time very well. And that was kind of the beginning of the end of the Royal 500. This is the last Royal 500, 1965. As you can see, they changed the concept of the whole radio. Dismal performing radio compared with earlier ones. Tuning was very difficult. Again, the small speaker, only 100 milliwatts of output, 2 IF stages. The competition from abroad was killing them. They couldn't sell radios for the high price anymore. Oh, that's something I need to go back to. The Royal 500H was $59.95, so they were already feeling the pressure of the prices. The Royal 500L came down to $39.95. And by the time the Royal 500N came, they sold those for $29.95. There was so much competition from abroad with actually some pretty decent radios out there for $20 or so, some less. And in reality, by the time they made that 500N, there were a lot of other radios from Japan and where else that worked as well or better than that one did. So that was a 10-year run for the Royal 500. It was a pretty long run, and most of it was really good stuff. They did make the best better up until the H. And if you're a serious broadcast band DX enthusiast, that 500H is a radio that you will really love. If we could go to where I have camera, I have a couple things I want to show. Is it possible to do that? Okay. This is that inverted cone speaker that they used in the 500D and the 500E. And next to it is a normal speaker. Well, that here, there we go. So you can see the difference there between those speakers. And the fidelity that they got from the inverted cone was slightly improved, but there was still a long way to go. It was a small speaker. This is the actual Royal 500H. Try to get the lighting here. And you can see the voice coil here is off center. There's no resonant point anywhere on this speaker. And there's the ceramic magnet technology. I'm going to turn it this way so you can see it. So these were all things that Zenith did that made for a really great radio. Because they made such a great radio, there were people that tried to copy what they did. And I have a couple here I'm going to show you real quick. This is the original Royal 500. And this one, a very rare radio, by the way. Notice the similarity. I'll try to get this. There we go. Look like the same radio. That's a Webster. It was made in England. Zenith told him, don't make any more of these because we're going to go to court. They they just copied too closely, obviously. But actually, by the time Zenith was moving on to the Royal 500H, there were a bunch of these that showed up. These were actually made in the United States, sold under various names. And as you can see in concept, they were certainly after the same thing. Zenith never bothered to stop this because they already had the H in the works. And these were an interesting radio, right down to the layout of the components on the circuit board. They're basically identical. Well, then there was another radio that came along. This is the real Royal 500H. And this one was a Japanese knockoff. Note the similarity. They turned it on its side, figuring they could get away with it. But if you look at it, very similar. And I don't know if I get close enough here to see the script on the dial. Probably not. But they even copied the dial script. The difference is this had the real speaker, and the other one had a tiny little speaker, even though it looked like a great big speaker. Very few of those got into the country. Zenith put a stop to that real quickly when those started to show up. Again, patent infringement. And so there are a few of those out there. For a collector, it's a great one to have in your Zenith collection, if you can find one of those. They were sold under the Lloyd's name. I've also seen one under a name Muscat, M-U-S-K-A-T. Very, very rare radio. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have. Oh, before I do, if you want more information and look more in depth at what this is all about, this is my book, Zenith Transistor Radio's Evolution of a Classic, and it covers basically what Zenith did for transistor radios. Oh, I see somebody else with one. It covers what Zenith did with transistor radios from the beginning up into the mid-60s and all the models that they came out with and many of the various things. And one of the chapters that you might really have fun with is that one called Clones. And it goes in depth to show you these other radios that copied in concept what Zenith was doing with a lot of their models. And you get to see interior photos and everything. So any questions anybody has, I'll be glad to try to answer them.
Norm, I have a question.
Yes.
Norm, my name is Marty. I'm in Bridgeville, Illinois. Where are you located?
I'm in Bradenton, Florida
very
in the
good.
wintertime. And I actually spend about 4 months of the year up in Michigan. If you're familiar with Saugatuck.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm about 6 miles south of Saugatuck during the
Very
summer.
good. Hey, does anybody in the club have a collection of these Zenith radios? You don't really see them very often.
There are a few other people that collect them.
Yeah, I collected mine a couple of years ago, or more than that. And I have a question. Do you have any tips on alignment or any common known failures in these radios? I've got two from the early era, and they sound a little bit off, and I don't know if somebody monkeyed with the alignment. Do you have any tips on tuning them? I've got original instructions from a Zenith engineer friend who's now passed away, but beyond that, I don't have any info.
Well, the thing I'll say, let's talk about the early ones first, because there's a big difference. Everything up to the 500E, probably the biggest problem anybody finds with them is electrolytic capacitors that are bad. That's real common. There's a coupling cap that's right up there by the volume control, and there are 3 or 4 other caps that are down underneath the battery compartment. And those frequently, almost always need to be replaced. And that can certainly restore a lot of performance. As far as the IF alignment, a 455 signal generator should, you should be able to do it with that, starting with the last IF and working your way up toward the top. I suppose I'd really have to, we'll have to talk more in depth as far as your problems with the tuning. Volume control, if it's scratchy, you can use what I've found to be really good on volume controls on these radios is a light oil like a sewing machine oil or 3-in-1 oil, something like that. Drop a little bit of that in there. It works really well. Not only does it remove the corrosion, but it gives a coating that keeps it from re-corroding for a long, long time. And let's talk about the 500H because that's real critical on that radio. Whatever material they use for the volume control on that is very easily damaged if you use the wrong chemical in it. So if you were to use like a tuner cleaner or deoxide or something like that in that control, you could destroy the carbon path. So in that one, if you have a touchy volume control, absolutely for sure use nothing but like a light oil, like say sewing machine oil or a 3-in-1. You can drop that in there and it'll smooth it right out and it'll last indefinitely. But be very, very careful with the volume control on the 500H because it's real easy to destroy it if you use the wrong materials.
Oh yeah, I sort of got scared of cleaners and materials in the early 70s when things were changing and you found that stuff we used to use just destroyed some of the cheap new stuff coming out. So I've always been real careful of the controls, but I think it's one of my 500s. It seems like as I tune towards the lower part of the band, I hardly hear any stations at all until I hit the very bottom and I can pick up a local station. I can't see anything wrong, but it just seems like it has no sensitivity down towards the bottom end of the AM band. And, we've got some strong stations here in this area.
Yeah, there again, is it strong and healthy at the top?
Seems to be, yeah. And the alignment is good. It's not off frequency.
Perhaps we should pick the diagnostics up to the open session at the end, see if there's any other questions.
That could be. As you see here, I've got a 500.
500E.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
if you
nice, very nice.
but look at the disaster on it. I was going to ask you, is there any?
Let's talk about that disaster.
Later.
There was a case where one group didn't talk to the other. They built that pretty radio. Unfortunately, it was easy to damage that metal on the front of that. So you went out and spent the extra $10 for the leather case to protect the radio. And you put that radio in there, and the first time you snapped that lid, the flap shut, it scraped the front of that radio and destroyed the metal. It was just, somebody really wasn't thinking when they designed that leather case.
Yeah, my grandfather had a radio like this at one time. This wasn't his, but it was reminiscent of that. And I remember as a kid, I used to play with that radio, and from Miami, I used to listen to WLS on this thing. That Veneer tuning on the thing that you mentioned is like a godsend. It is just it's typical of a Zenith radio to me, but just in a small form factor. So, but I hope to restore this thing. I don't remember if it works or not, but I've yet to take it apart. But you reminded me, I still have one left in the corner, in my pile of stuff here too. And
Well, for what it's worth, I listen to WGN almost every night. I'm down here in Bradenton, Florida, and I like to listen to Ray James. I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard her. She's on like at 11 o'clock at night or something. But she talks radio a lot, and so I like to listen to her show. And I listen to her on WGN nearly every night on my Royal 500.
You're in Florida. Where are you again? Where you're located?
I'm in Bradenton, Florida.
Yeah, that's a good. I live near that area. Once I moved out of Miami, I could hear all the Chicago stations, GN, WBBM, and WLS reliably at night too. So you're good. Appreciate the info, and it was an interesting presentation.
Yeah, Norm, that was an outstanding presentation, Norm, and I'd like to thank you for that and all the effort you put into producing that. And We welcome you back. We welcome you back to do it again on another one of your many topics in those books. So,
Well, I'd be happy to do that. And just if any of you guys want any, feel free to call me or email me, and I'll help you any way I can with your Royal 500.
yeah, we can put your contact information in the chat window here, and then everybody will have it if you choose to do that.
That'd be great.
This is Keith, and I had a quick question. On the speaker, if the offset voice coil was so great and reproduced the sounds so terrific, how come today's audiophiles, we don't see those speakers with the offset coils?
Because it was a compact speaker. When you get to a much larger speaker, you really don't need to do that. But to get that much speaker in that small of a box, that's what that was all about. If you look at the distance from the voice coil out to the outer rim on that speaker, see that? It's pretty, it gives you a much better ability to get lower frequency tone and high frequency with the other. So you're able to do that all in one unit in a compact radio. If you get a radio with a 5-inch speaker or above, you probably don't need to do this.
Norm, how does it sound? How does the speaker sound?
I wish I could demonstrate it on here because it is phenomenally good. It
Yeah,
really
I think it would be.
very
We'll
transparent.
talk about that more in the open session at the end, because we do have to watch the clock here because we've got 3 more presenters upcoming here. So Norm, I'll thank you again and say welcome to do it again, and hope to see you again on our show here.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
All right. So our next presenter, Joe Koester, is going to be doing part 2 of the radio refinishing presentation that he started last month. So without any further delay here, I'll turn it over to Joe.
All righty. Well, we're back again with a little bit more on radio cabinet restoration. And we're going to look at replacing and repairing veneer. So let's get on with that. By the way, I see an old friend on here, Neal Baitcher. I understand he's relocated to the area. And first picture I've seen of Neal in a long time. So welcome, Neal.
Thank you. I'd be glad to talk about speakers. I designed cones for 40 years. I know all about that speaker. So if anybody's interested, I'd be glad to go into it in more detail.
Okay, we're gonna talk about the veneer on here. There's a couple of ways to do it. Let's assume that we've already cleaned the radio up and we've taken the old veneer off of it. And I just did one last night, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So if you're going to re-veneer the radio, there are 2 ways to do it. You can buy new veneer, and a place like Woodcraft will sell you a roll of about I think it's 2 feet by 8 feet of walnut or mahogany or whatever. And it's pretty easy to work with. It's got a backing on it. And one of the nice things about the veneer with the backing is it's not quite as fragile as the other. It will, because of the back, it will allow you to bend it if you have to go over a curve. And it'll give you, if there's any little slight imperfections underneath of it, it won't show. Whereas some of the veneer that does not have a backing, it tends to be more fragile. Some of the worst I've ever dealt with is a walnut burl, because it's extremely thin, and the ones I've had did not come with a backing. And it's easy to break, to cause all kinds of problems with it. So one of the first things you want to do, let's say you have a piece of radio that's going to have a piece, say 12 by 18 for the heck of it. Well, then you want to cut your new veneer maybe 12 1/8 or 12 1/4 by 18 1/8 or 18 1/4. You don't want a whole lot, but you don't want to cut it so close that when you put it down, you say, uh-oh, it doesn't quite cover the radio. And you have to have at least 2 nice squared edges. Now, the one I'm going to talk about here later on is a Zenith Tombstone, a 1937 Zenith 10S130. And as of last night, I started to replace the veneer on the sides. So I'm going to start out with a nice square piece that's going to butt up against the front and the bottom, because the top and the back are where I can trim it and sand it. So you want to use a T-square and get very, very straight, very clean edges. And I suggest using an X-Acto knife because you can put a new blade in there and get a real good cut on it. By the way, when you start cutting, if you start from one end, that's fine. But when you get near the other end, stop and start at the raw edge to go forward, because as you come off of that piece, you're liable to split that veneer at the very end there, if that makes sense to you. So, okay, we've already taken the veneer off and everything. And I neglected to say, you can, if you have the old veneer, a lot of times I save boxes of old veneer, and I find sometimes that the old veneer, if I'm not putting a real big piece on, I'll find something that has grain similar to what I'm replacing, and it makes sense to use that. But before you use it, you want to make sure you've stripped it and get all the crud off of it, so you've got some nice clean veneer. So what I like to do is sand it with about 100 grit sandpaper, and if I've got any little dents or peaks in it, I can put some wood filler in there, and then sand that till I get a nice smooth surface. Now you don't want to go up to say 220 or anything, because you want the glue to adhere. So it's nice to keep it about 100 or no more than 150 grit sandpaper. As I said, you want a little bit of edge on it, on the edges that don't butt up, so that you can trim it, make everything match up. And also, if your grain ran from top to bottom, don't put the new grain in running from side to side. And lastly, you want to clean the surface off before you put the veneer on. And you can use a tack cloth or whatever, but I think an air compressor is really good. Blow all that dust away. Now, I use typically, in most applications, I'll use a good woodworker's glue to keep it in place. But as we're going to talk about later, do not use a waterproof or external glue. They didn't use it in the factories, and you don't need it on the cabinet unless you plan on leaving that wall set out in the rain. So let's not use that, because it can cause some other problems. So once we're ready to go here, we're going to put our glue on there on the usually I would put it on the radio, the cabinet itself, and then I'll very carefully put the veneer on it, and I'll roll it around and put a little bit of pressure on it, and I'll take the veneer off, and I'll look and see if there's any places where I don't have any glue. If I do, then I'll put a little more glue in that area. Now, you don't want to just put this down real heavy, because it's going to cause more problems, but you're going to get it in there, and you're going to make sure it's adhering. And once you know that you don't have any voids in there, then I've got a little roller. I have one that's wooden and one that's metal, and I roll it all around and get all the air bubbles out of it. Work from the center to the edges. Now, mind you, we've already aligned that thing up, so we're not going to have any surprises when we get done. And then if you have any glue that's oozed out of it, get a paper towel and clean it off. And if you have to, you can wet that paper towel. That glue will come off easier with a wet rag or towel. So once we put it down there, we need to make sure that we have it adhere. So there's a couple of ways to do it. And when I had to replace a battery in my car, I saved that battery. It weighs about 55 pounds. And boy, if you've got a top on a console or something, then that's real good. And you want some kind of wood that's going to apply even pressure. So let's just talk about, say, the top of a console. Generally speaking, get a piece of 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch plywood, put it on there, and then put your weight on it. Now, if you can, you want to clamp the edges. If, for example, we're talking again about the back of a console, in this case maybe the side. Well, you have a place where you can clamp it. So you can put a board on that veneer, but you want to put a piece of wax paper underneath it, because the glue won't adhere to the wax paper. Then you can clamp it down on that edge where you can do it. And in the center, you can put your battery or whatever, your weight. Or if you have a piece of plywood, you can clamp from either side. If it's a heavy plywood, mind you, say 3/4, that will allow you to get an even pressure on it. So after we've got it on there and it's dried, we want to trim all the excess off. And as I'll show you on that other picture there, What I like to do is I use an X-Acto knife, and its key is to have a sharp blade. So when you start cutting, I like to cut, say, if I've got a piece that's 12 inches and I'm going to trim off some, I'll cut in the middle and work to either edge. And that way, as I get close to the edge, I can get very close to it. Then I can come to the far ends and work toward it. And that way I don't split any of my veneer on the edges. And after you've trimmed it down to a 1/16 or so of an inch, get your sanding block and you can sand it down. Now, again, start from the edge where you might tend to split it and sand toward the center of it. And once you do that, you're going to have it cleaned off very well. You may find a little glue line, and it's pretty easy to strip that away with your X-Acto knife. And then after you've got the veneer down and it's all trimmed up, you can sand it. I would go lightly with a 150, a 220, and then finally a 340 or 400, and you'll get that looking good. And if you have a curved surface, you want to be very careful because it's so easy to sand through that curved surface. Now there's another technique, and well, this is one that I just tried, and I had pretty good luck with it. I'm going to try it again. You can take that piece of veneer that you have carefully measured, and you know that it's going to fit, and then you can put a coat of glue on that veneer and on the radio and set them aside until they're completely dry. They'll have a little bit of a sheen on them. You don't want them tacky or anything. I'd let them dry overnight even. Now, you'll find sometimes that veneer will tend to curl, but that's okay. And the nice thing about this is you can precisely position that on there, that veneer on there, and make sure it's going to fit. And then you're going to take a hot iron and you're going to go over that, and you're going to start, say, right at the edge, the two edges that are going to butt up against, say, the bottom and the front of the radio, and then work yourself toward the back and the top. And you're going to find that this works very, very well. Now, this is key here. If you're going to use a woodworker's glue, the Elmer's or something like that, the yellow stuff, that's fine. But do not use the exterior glue, because there's something in there that it may tend to migrate through that veneer. Now, there is also a heat-activated glue. Sometimes I haven't had any success with it. I tried to buy it, but they were out of it. And I have a friend that uses it. He swears by it. I've had good luck with this woodworker's glue. So I'm going to stick with that. Now, here we go. This is the 10S130 Zenith. And you can see up there on the top, I put on, it's actually two pieces of veneer on there, and I use that technique there. And then on the front, it has a walnut burr on the top shoulder on the front, and on one side there was a hole in it. So I bought this walnut burr. Now this stuff does not have a backing on it, and it's somewhat fragile, but I trimmed it just slightly larger, and you can see where I butted it against the top of that bottom column. That's what I'm talking about, and then toward the center part of the radio. So what little bit of excess that I had, my extra measurement, was on the outside and the top side, and that allowed me to sand that smooth. Now, this radio, I don't have a slide here to show it, but after I got started on it, the veneer on the side was a strip missing on the back, and I could not match it. So I had to take the veneer off of both sides, and I'm going to re-veneer those. Now, what I did is I used that hot iron. I got a steam iron at the thrift store for $4, and it works great. And I sprayed a little bit of water on the veneer and used that steam iron, and I took the old veneer off, some of which I saved. So there's some residue on there on this radio, and I'm going to go over it with a little bit of steel wool and maybe with some water, and then I'm going to sand it. Then I'm going to cut my veneer and follow these procedures that I've just outlined, and I'm going to use this hot iron veneer on it again. So I'll let you know how it works out next month, or in March rather, when we do part 3. Maybe I'll show you a picture of the finished product if it turned out well. If it didn't, I'm going to ignore that I ever said this. Okay, now we're going to talk about a radio that's a little different, and this is one of them that has curves on it. And in this case right here, it's a Philco 90. And the veneer that I had was not long enough to go over from one side to one side. So what I did is I had to piece it in, and I did it down at the bottom. So if I'd have run the veneer the other way, the grain on this veneer runs front to back. If I'd have run it the other way, I could have done it, but it wouldn't have been original. So in this case right here, I didn't want to use that woodworking glue because it's going to be kind of difficult to get it, make sure it adheres well on there. So I used contact cement. And contact cement you're probably familiar with is this is something, again, you put it on there. It's a rubber-based material, and you let it dry, and you put it on both surfaces. But as soon as you touch it, it's going to adhere. You don't need to apply heat to it. So in this case, what we're going to do is going to put some wax paper underneath this thing as we lay it down and make sure it lines up. And then we're going to very carefully take the wax paper out, and we're going to roll this. So here was the original radio, and it was a real mess. The arch was missing, so I had to cut an arch out. That's the original veneer. You can see it peeling off of it. And I had to put the arch in first, and I drove a few little nails through that underlayment, which is no problem because we're going to cover it with the veneer. And again, we sanded this thing down real well with the 100 to 150 grit, and then made sure it got all of the dust off of it. So the contact cement was used, and you can see the big piece of veneer going on there, and it's got the contact cement on the radio and on the veneer. That's my wife is holding that on there at the front, and you can see it laying on there, and I've got the wax paper in there so that it won't adhere. And once we got it all lined up and made sure it was going to work, then I started to roll it on there. But you want to be careful about this because once you get them on there, it's going to be a bear to get them off, and you're probably going to destroy your veneer doing it. So you got one shot at this. So there's the little roller I told you about it. We got the center section lined up, and it's pretty much even on either side where I'm going to piece those pieces in. And you can see how you roll that on there and remove the wax paper as you go. And it went on very well, and it was a success. And you can see there, I'm talking about the trimming. Now I had about a ½ inch of veneer left on that radio, and you can see how far down on the edge that it went. You can see where my seam is. So I've got the bottom two pieces of veneer coming up and matching the top, and you can see how the grain runs front to back. And my little seam in there is going to be very hard to find when I get through finishing it. But you can see how we trim using the X-Acto knife and the sandpaper, how we get a nice smooth edge on there. Well, that wasn't the only problem with the radio. It was coming apart all over. The front came off of the back, so we had to clamp that on. And as I mentioned before, in cabinet repair, you can never have too many clamps, and this will attest to that. Now you can see on the right side there where the new veneer is on there, and it's all the way down to the top, and it's been trimmed, and now we're putting the front on. And once that gets on, we're going to deal with the speaker grill in the front panel. And this Philco had all kinds of problems. I had to piece veneer all over that. Now, I did not replace all the veneer on it, but I pieced veneer in there. And that's fairly easy to do. It's a small surface. You use the same thing, the woodworking glue. I didn't bother using an iron. I wasn't even into that technique there. But the only damage was right up around the speaker grill. And again, you can see all the clamps and how that works. Now we're gonna move on to another radio. We're gonna look at a Zenith console, an IS-262. And after I cleaned it and stripped it and whatever, I had some veneer damage at the back, near the bottom. So in this case, I used some veneer from, I think it was that Philco 90, because it was available, and the grain pattern seemed to match pretty good. So what I did is, after I got the radio down, say I had a piece of veneer to replace about 2 inches long and 1 inch wide. Well, I cut a piece of veneer, a square out about 3 inches by 3 inches or so, and I laid it over it, but I made some marks on the radio so I knew where my damage was. And I taped it on there, and then I used an X-Acto knife and I cut through both pieces of the veneer at the same time. And you'll see we made a sort of not a triangular cut, but kind of a meandering cut that might sort of resemble some wood grain. And we'll next show you the next slide here. There's the piece of veneer on the left that I laid over. You can see the damage. There's two more pieces there on that left slide where I'm going to have to piece them in. And I cut a piece that would sort of approximate what you might imagine wood grain could possibly look like on that radio. A lot of times there's various wood grain patterns, and this actually turned out pretty good when it was all done. So I laid the new veneer on there, and then I cut it off the back, and I cut through it, and you can see the cut I made, and that went through both pieces. And then the same procedure is you're going to put glue on both sides of it. You're going to make sure it works there, and you're going to clamp it down. And you can see at the back, I left a little tail there that I'm going to trim off. Same thing as I said, the wood block, the wax paper, clamped it. Then I trimmed it and got rid of the excess glue. And I did the other gluing on the cabinet, and I made sure the cabinet was nice and sound. Now there's another clamp that I've got. It's called a pony band clamp, and it's a long canvas, strip, I guess you would say. It's about 4 or 5 feet long, and you can wrap it around it, and it's got a little ratchet, and you can ratchet it down and put pressure real good with that thing. And there's the veneer patches right there. Of course, now they stand out pretty much right now, but after you stain it, and what I did is I took some wood filler. I think in this case I had some plastic wood, some colored plastic wood, and added some acetone to it to thin it. And I worked it down in the cracks between the old veneer and the new veneer. And the nice thing about the plastic wood or some of these other wood fillers, not a grain filler, but a wood filler, is that they will take the stain. And there's techniques that you can make it look, you can barely see these repairs if you do it properly. And it's not that hard to do. I especially like that one patch on the bottom there, the longer one and the thinner one. That really did approximate the grain on that radio. It's a little hard to see it from the picture, but in reality, it did look like it could be a grain pattern. We sanded it, and it was ready to put the finish on it. So that's pretty much the basics of veneering for right now. And in March, we'll look at staining and graining and toning and filling and spraying. And we'll look at a couple of these same radios that we've talked about right here. So with that, that pretty much wraps up what I had to say on the veneering.
Well, great, Joe. Thank you very much. We look forward to the third part in March. Any questions for Joe on?
I have a question. Hey, Joe, do you ever try beveling the edge when you're cutting so it overlaps?
Yeah, I've done it. I've done it inadvertently, but I like to get it as tight as I can with a beveled edge. When I fill it in, my crack or my seam is going to be a little bit wider with the filler, so it would tend to make the joint a little wider than it needs to be. If I'm only an X-Acto blade wide, it's not quite as noticeable.
Okay, thanks.
I'd like to ask a question if that's all right.
Sure.
I'm gonna start my video. I have to re-veneer the top of, I don't know if I'm doing this the right way, this Atwater Kent Keel table. It's 12-sided, and I am not quite sure how to lay my new piece of veneer down along an edge to cut it straight. So I have to re-veneer this tabletop. It's 12-sided. I haven't started it because I haven't decided how to fit my new piece of veneer along an edge.
Okay, I guess there's a couple of ways to do that. When I was wintering in Arizona, I went to a woodworking shop and I bought a 4x8 piece of walnut veneer.
Mm-hmm.
Same as a sheet of plywood. And I got a lot of plywood, a lot of veneer out of there. Now, if I'm trying to remember what the keel table, it may have had a pattern in there. It may have had a burl or a book match or something. It may have been maybe 4 pieces of veneer came together. I don't remember. If you want to do it the simplest way and just put a straight walnut top on it, you can buy a large piece of veneer, take your top off, and what I would do is I would get a piece of paper or something and cut a pattern from the top and make sure it's a little bit bigger than the top. And in this case, I might use that hot iron technique and put it all down in one piece. But if you want to get fancy and if you want to put 4 pieces of veneer on there, that's going to be a little more difficult. But you can, there's a source of veneer in Miami. It's called Constantine's. And they can give you some really nice veneer. Again, you need to look at that and decide if you want 1 piece or if you want to try to get fancy and put a couple of book match pieces or something in there to give you a pattern. I did that on a Scott Napier front, and it had a chevron pattern on it. So I bought a piece from Constantine's, and I was able to do 4 fronts for the Napier with a chevron pattern that came up like this. So it all depends on what you want to do on there. The simplest way is 1 piece. If not, you can still use your template pattern and cut 4 pieces out and find the exact center of that radio and work out from there. That's the way I do it. I've never done one of those, but if I was going to attempt it, I'd try something like that. And I'm not an expert in veneering, by the way. So,
Fair enough. I was just trying to decide how I should try to fit it, but I think I like the template idea, so I'm going to give that a shot. I'm going to do it with a single piece, though.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
Great. Any other questions for Joe? Okay, that's great, Joe. Thank you very much, and we look forward to part 3 coming up.
Okay, I thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to have to bail out of here. We might have 7 inches of snow by tomorrow, and I've got to go run a few errands, make a few phone calls. So thanks for the opportunity, and I want to thank Tom for the slides. He's done a remarkable job on the PowerPoints. I didn't do them. I couldn't do them. I can just talk to him. So thanks very much. And Neal, good seeing you again, and I'll catch you guys in March. Bye now.
Great, Joe. Thank you very much. So with that, we're now going to move on to our 3rd presentation for this morning. And Robert Lozier is a longtime presenter at these meetings. And we thought originally he was going to talk about the Telefunken that he talked about last meeting, but he's not quite done with that. So he's going to share with us today a couple of unique techniques that he uses in his restorations of 1920s era radios. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Robert.
Okay, thank you. Let me get my video up here. And that should be full screen for you. And so the news is it runs for 13 minutes and 35 seconds. So you know how long you got for a potty break or go to have a cup of coffee. But I'll play the video and then invite any follow-up questions. This is really a hints and kinks presentation as a result of working on restoration of radios made by the Sumter Radio Manufacturing Company of Sumter, South Carolina, around 1922 to 1924. As far as I can tell, they may have been the first and only maker of name-brand broadcast receivers in the state in the 1920s. At this point, there are 4 of these sets known to be in existence, and it is rumored that there is one in a South Carolina state museum. None of the versions are identical. Serial number tags suggest that there may have been about 500 sets built over maybe a 2-year period. The 3 I know about are in poor to awful condition. All appear to be sets with 1 stage of TRF, a non-regenerative detector, and 2 stages of audio. All front panels are hard rubber in either gloss black or this faux wood grain. The tuning condensers and the terminal strips are also hard rubber. All these hard rubber front panels are warped. These panels are unpredictable in how much heat they can tolerate, and the heat must be applied very evenly. My kitchen oven temperature swings wildly as it cycles. I've measured temperature swings of greater than 50 degrees. This is the third time I have used a makeshift solar oven to heat the hard rubber panel enough to soften so it can be clamped between two sheets of MDF shelving for cooling. It is easy to make and use if you have a sturdy camera tripod. I have 3 of them. I have a piece of scrap plywood, maybe 14 inches square. In the center, I drilled a hole to take a 1/4-20 T-nut. They are made for 3/4 inch thick lumber, so I had to add a little square of 1/4 inch plywood to make sure that the threaded barrel would not extend beyond the surface. As you can see, I attached the panel to the bottom of a cardboard box using zip ties. This screws onto the standard camera tripod mount. In the bottom of the box, I placed a scrap sheet of styrofoam insulation to limit heat loss. The idea is to prop the warped panel up against the styrofoam panel in the bottom of the box and cover the box with a thin sheet of clear polyethylene film. I use a disposable poly drop cloth. I happen to have a multimeter with a switch setting to take these dirt cheap K-top thermocouples, so I place the tip between the panel and the styrofoam sheet. If the air temperature outside is approaching 60 degrees Fahrenheit and the sun is shining brightly, the temperature on the back side of the rubber panel should rise to above 140 degrees Fahrenheit in about 15 minutes. Make sure that the box is oriented directly at the sun so the panel is evenly illuminated. After a 20-minute soak, put on a pair of cotton gloves and quickly remove the panel and immediately clamp between 2 pieces of MDF shelving. Double check that you have adjusted your clamps so that the boards are perfectly parallel, meaning that all parts of your rubber panel are receiving the same pressure. Put your clamped assembly out of the sun and wait at least 30 minutes for the panel to return to ambient temperature. So here is the hard rubber panel after flattening using the solar oven. It took a lot of elbow grease to brighten this panel. I used Gojo and steel wool. You wipe away the Gojo with mineral spirits before judging your progress. Never ever use any cleaner containing water on old hard rubber. I finished using a car wax containing a mild abrasive, often described as deep cleaning car wax. I determined that it was too risky to aggressively sand away to eliminate all the fading, although this texturing does go all through the panel. So the warping is only one of the many problems with these surviving sets. They are completely wired with 18-gauge solid wire covered with varnished cambered tubing. All the components had to come off the panel for flattening. All the other parts of the set were equally awful, with rust, oxidation, and pure old crud. This dry-rotted tubing is as brittle as glass and would not respond to any cleaning at all, the tubing coating now being embedded with crud. These are scarce artifacts, and I want to do my work faithful to the original. In each radio, there is some 12 to 14 feet of this tubing required, but I was confident that I had a solution. A few years ago, I developed a method to make replica varnished cambered tubing for the Atwater Kent breadboard receivers. It worked, but there was a problem with two of the steps in the procedure. So in the past couple of weeks, I have come up with a better way. The technique involves using 3 32nd-inch diameter, thin wall polyolefin 2-to-1 shrink ratio tubing. I insert a length of 25-pound test monofilament fishing line down through the tubing, being sure to allow about a foot extra sticking out each end. Then you insert a length of 0.47-inch diameter steel music wire into the tubing. You can get this at hobby shops that have model airplane supplies. You can also buy reels of this wire online, but it is a pain to straighten. The hobby shop lengths come in 3-foot lengths, but cut them to about 28 inches. Then insert so that the tubing extends about an inch from the music wire on each end. Use a hot air gun with a temperature control to use the minimum amount of heat to shrink the tubing completely. Pull very gently on the monofilament line as you go. FireMountainBeadsAndGems.com is an online craft store. They have finely braided 3mm diameter cotton cord. Beware! You will find on Amazon other 3mm cord that is not made of cotton and may be much more coarsely braided. It can even say at the top of the listing that it is made of cotton in bold print, but in the fine print it will say it's 100% polyester. I know it sounds crazy, but Amazon says that the listing heading is only a product name. It is not a product description. That is in the fine print. Anyway, you need cotton fibers to dye with commonly available RIT dye. All that is necessary to dye the braid is a cup of water and a 1/4 teaspoon of dye heated up in a microwave. Drop a washed hank of the white braid in a jar of the hot dye and stir for a few minutes with a stainless steel or plastic spoon. Wait maybe 5 minutes or so and stir again a few times. Place back into the microwave for a 30-second zap. A quick stir and wait 20 minutes or so before lifting the hank of tubing out of the dye. Use a kitchen sprayer with cold water to flush away the excess dye, then allow the braid to dry. You then fish a wire through the braided tube and crimp on the end of the monofilament to pull the braid over your heat shrink tubing assembly. Allow your dyed braid to extend at least 3/4 of an inch past the ends of the music wire and take the time to stretch the braid as tightly as you can. It sounds complicated, but it's really quite easy to do and straightforward, and does not take a lot of time to this point once you have the materials at hand. So since I had so much tubing to make, I came up with this simple fixture to process multiple lengths of tubing. It is made from a scrap length of 2x2, a couple of end plates of 3/4-inch plywood scrap, about 5 inches square, and some 3/8-inch poplar wooden dowels. I hope you can see that I take scrap string and lash the ends of the braid as tight as I can. Then at the far end of the fixture, I tie the string to a dowel peg. On the near end dowel pins, I added a crosswise 1/8-inch hole for fishing through the string and tie a knot. I have cut a slot in the ends of the dowels and reinforced with some iron wire so that I can insert a screwdriver blade and turn to take up the slack in my tubing assembly. I run my fingers back and forth along the braid to make sure it is pulled as tightly as practical. Maybe you can see that the fixture is supported in the middle by a bench vise. This gives me easy access to 2 of the tubing lengths. Then the 2x2 is rotated 180 degrees to give you easy access to the other two tubing lengths. You are ready to coat the cotton braid. This is done with Titebond 2 slow set glue colored with trans-tint dyes available at woodcraft shops. For this tubing, I added 2 drops of a honey amber dye to a teaspoon of glue and thoroughly mixed it. I used a stiff artist brush to paint the glue on the braid. This is a messy process, but no matter. You simply take a pad of kitchen plastic wrap and drag it back and forth along the braid to even it out. You are trying to saturate the braid with the glue and remove excess. Once the glue saturates the braid, you may need to tighten the dowel pegs slightly. Allow the glue to dry for several hours. Then apply a liberal coat of marine spar varnish and allow to dry completely. Before applying a second and final coat, drag a pad of 4/0 steel wool along your tubing to cut off any bumps or fuzz on the tubing. Then apply the final coat. Once you have the lengths finished, untie the pull string on each end. Then clamp one end of the monofilament line in a vise and gently pull the line out of the assembly. If you get too much resistance, switch to the other end of the monofilament. It should now pull free of your tubing without excessive force. Now cut away a bit of tubing from each end of the music wire and clamp one end of the music wire into the vise. You should now have little trouble in pulling your finished tubing off of the steel wire. And presto, you are done. So how did it turn out? The green arrow points to the least awful length of the original tubing. Everything else in the larger picture is my replica tubing. I'm pretty happy with it. I'll have to make another batch of tubing for another Sumter set soon.
Robert, that was fantastic. I'll open it up for questions here. I thought I heard a question, or maybe that was just the riffraff.
I have a question for Robert. I noticed you use spar varnish for your finish coats. Doesn't that get very, very hard? I used to use Valspar on outdoor projects, and man, it got like iron coat. Would a regular varnish, or is there a particular reason for spar?
Well, apparently nowadays, maybe because of eco-friendliness and all that sort of thing, there are spar varnishes that have tung oil in them, and they're brittle. They're very glossy too. But the spar varnish that I use is doesn't say that it has tung oil in it, so it remains flexible, and so not a problem. But yet, unfortunately, you have to go into the fine print on your particular brand and to make sure that you don't get those that have the tung oil in them.
Yeah, that's another one that I used to like, was way back when there was a brand of tung oil with Bakelite, and I got beautiful finishes off of it, and not available. The tung oil is available now. By the third coat, they seem to strip everything right back off. But yeah, my Valspar is gone too. The current owner of that name doesn't make a spar varnish at all anymore.
Okay, any other questions for Robert? Robert, I must say that you go through a lot of detailed effort to restore your radios, and I can see those things ending up in museums someday. You've done excellent work.
Well,
They survive longer than the original.
They may, yeah. Let's hope so. But yeah, I go to these unreasonable amounts of work just because of wanting to do a museum quality restoration. I realize that that's not for everybody. So, but maybe it'll help you think outside the box whenever you've got a problem to try to resolve.
Hey, Robert, I got a question. How far you are from finishing that Sumter?
Oh, I have quite a bit to do on it. Another several weeks. There's actually a documentation issue in that at least 3 of these presumably 5 radios don't have the audio transformers are gone from them. So the question is, what's right? And I have a hint that they may be Jefferson transformers, but I'm hoping that this alleged unit that's in a South Carolina State Museum, I hope we can get a snapshot of it, and maybe it'll have some clues inside.
Okay, thank you.
I hate when you can't document everything right.
Robert, I do have one more question. I saw that set has the open frame wire wound rheostats in it. And my grandfather's 1929 gray bar here, the volume control is open frame. Do you have any hints or suggestions for cleaning and care of those? Because mine seems to be, and I've never gone back to look at it, but you know, little intermittent, scratchy. Are there any things you can do to clean those up?
Well, actually, I don't have any real, especially I'm presuming that your gray bar that has a really fine gauge wire in it. The rheostats and potentiometers in these Sumters are actually made by the Sumter Radio Manufacturing Company. And I found a listing in 1923 Radio News where they had been approved products by the Radio News laboratories. And but those thicker gauge wire and all that, it just needed a cleanup. Nothing special.
Okay, thank you. One of these days I may get around to finally going back into the radio. It's a difficult project because he installed it in a floor standing cabinet, and you have to take a few things apart to get the radio out. And I also lost the hinges for the drop front panel to a guy who was going to get them cleaned up for me years ago. And then he left the place we were working, and I never saw my hinges again and can't find anything like them.
Okay. Robert, I'd like to thank you again. And we also look forward to hearing about part 2 of that Telefunken at some point in the future. So,
well, that's my goal anyway, to
we'll
resolve that.
Okay, great. If no further questions for Robert, we'll move on to our 4th and final presentation of the morning. And Bill Ballad is going to talk to us about a Silvertone radio that when he opened it up, he found a surprise in terms of what was inside. Bill?
Okay, we got the screen on already. Okay. Basically, this is a radio that I got for repair work. A friend has had several of these radios that I've worked on for him. When the radio came, or when I got it, started looking at it and noted that the audio output tube was a 25L6. Now that suggested that this was a series filament, not a parallel filament. But the curious thing was that this is listed as an AC only radio. Now that got me sort of confused. I hadn't seen that before. We can see here that the radio has a rather curious power supply. It uses an auto transformer. If you look at the bottom of the schematic here, you can see that transformer is really only one winding. This is very much the same thing as we see in the Variac variable transformers that everybody uses. It's a single winding that is then tapped at different levels to get different voltages. You can see at the bottom of the schematic, they actually have blown up the picture of the power supply to show the details. The power line comes in, and one side of the power line is connected to ground, and the other side is connected to a tap on the transformer. And then other taps are used to get the filament voltages and also the high voltage. The point being that the power line, actually one side of the power line is actually connected to the ground, which is the chassis. And you can see where it is. This is, sorry about the quality of the picture, but you can see that right in the center of the picture, you can see the power line coming in and connecting to that tie point, which is in fact the ground point of the chassis. That puts the chassis in a rather poor situation. What that means is that one side of the power line is connected to the metal of the chassis, and since the plug on the power line is non-polarized, it leaves the chassis connected directly to 110 volts. If you get a 50-50 chance. One side of the power line is the neutral, which is basically at ground potential. The other side of the power line, of course, is 120 volts. And if you touch the metal part of the cabinet and the thing is plugged in, you can get a considerable shock. Indeed, it can be quite dangerous. Yeah, this is the modification. When I received the set had been repaired already, recapped and done, but they'd also added this modification. They'd attached an RCA phono plug to the back of the set and put a switch in so that they could switch between an external connection and the internal connection that allowed you to plug in some sort of device to listen to the set. This, of course, is a very bad idea in this particular set, because if you were to plug a grounded device into this, you run a very good chance of connecting the grounded device to the 110 volt line, which would result in a considerable problem for you. I don't quite understand why this was done. Apparently the person that made the modification didn't really understand what he was doing. Anyway, in this particular set, I removed these modifications. I took out the RCA jack and the switch and returned the set to its original condition. And then I added a cardboard backing to it. Now that's the set. On the side, you can see the auto transformer sitting there. It's a little curious why this set was done with this auto transformer. It was not a common practice. The idea of using an auto transformer rather than a regular transformer. And of course, very soon after this is 1938 date on. Very soon after that, they went to AC/DC sets for the low cost sets. So what we have here is a rather curious situation. If you want to see a good demonstration of a repair on this set, go to Rob's Fix-It Shop on YouTube. 1938 Silvertone radio repair and restoration. He did a rather nice restoration on a set I disagree with his idea. What he did was to install a 3-wire power line and ground the chassis to the third wire. Now that can result in a rather safe radio, but on the other hand, if you ran across a improperly wired socket, you could be connecting the ground directly to the power line. So I wonder if that's a good solution or not. Anyway, that's the radio I ran across, and a rather interesting thing. Any questions on that one now?
Would you consider using a 2-wire polarized plug?
Well, what I did was I used a 2-wire and with a polarized plug.
That's what I meant. Yeah, that's what I would have done. And then, of course, those kind of radios, I have an isolation transformer when I usually play them anyway.
Oh, well, when working on it, I use an isolation transformer.
Yeah, in my display area, I have a big isolation transformer for that type of stuff. Don't want to take a chance.
Yep, it's an interesting idea.
When I was younger, I really got zapped badly when that happened. My dad tried to listen to early stereo broadcasting, an AM radio and an FM radio, and somehow I got touching one and the other, and I got zapped really bad. They were both AC/DC sets.
Yeah, I had an old S38 back when I was young, and would occasionally get zapped by that. That's the Hallicrafters, which was an AC/DC set.
I have a quick question. This is Keith, by the way.
Yeah.
Do you know if that radio came from California? And when you pulled that mod out of the back, did it go through from the jack, did it go through a couple of 10K resistors to a power transformer that was plastic encapsulated and blue in color?
No.
Okay.
No, this radio came from I don't know where it came from, but no, there's the connection was made directly from the jack to the switch to the volume control. He was just switching in and out of the volume control. This is not the one you're looking at. Yeah, the manufacturer was actually to Silvertone. Sears, of course, didn't make it. And Sears didn't make radios. What they did was contract it out. This came from Colonial in Buffalo, was the manufacturer.
Okay, that's fine. I just know someone who does that, and it burns me up when he does it.
Yeah, well, it was a bad idea. That's just what the only thing you can say. I think. I don't know that everybody realizes that AC/DC radios in general are somewhat dangerous and need to be handled in a different fashion.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Bill, for the great presentation. And that's certainly a unique radio. I've never came across a auto transformer power supply in that era of a radio, so that's really cool.
Yeah, there are very few auto transformers used. I ran across at least one other Silvertone that has an auto transformer in it, and apparently some other people have used auto transformers in their design.
Okay. Well, thanks, Bill, for that presentation, and that wraps up the presentation section. And before we get into the show and tell tips and techniques part, I'd like to put up a poll here and also ask you to be a presenter. It's pretty easy to do, and as you may have inferred from some of the conversation today, that both Matt and I will help you put together a presentation. If you've got some collection or something really interesting to share with us, and you're not real up to speed on making slides and that sort of thing and hooking to Zoom, we can work with you. So that was my comment, that it's really easy to be a presenter, and it's a way for us all to share what we know about radios, and we can help you with the technical aspects of it if you're so inclined. So please consider being a presenter. And with that being said, if there are any show and tells today, let's do that now. Is there anybody out there that wants to do a quick show and tell?
Well, I got out my 2-radio Royal 500 collection here when I saw the topic for today, and I'll just hold these up. This one, I think, this is the one that's marked long distance. So it's in a little rougher condition, but still plays. I guess, you can tell this is what, at least second or third, or I forget which generation this one comes up. And the other one I've got is a little cleaner condition. Neither of these had cases when I found them. This is an earlier, it does say tubeless 7 transistor on it. They both have the Veneer tuning. I think this is the one that I was asking about, where it seems like it doesn't have good pickup at the low end of the band, but got interested many years back when these were still a pretty hot item and not too hard to find. And I had always wanted one, but what I got for 8th grade graduation, my dad went out and got me a Royal 150, which still works well. Its little cardboard case fell apart decades ago, but I've carried this with me since my 8th grade graduation. It's still in pretty clean shape, except for one little tiny thumb dent that I think I put in the grill. And this one was also a good AM DXer. I would regularly listen to WLW with this one and any number of other ones back in the day, but this is from about 61, and I've managed to keep it in good, clean shape. So just wanted to show off what for me in those days was really fascinating, transistor radios. And I used to pour over the pages in the Sears catalog, wishing and hoping for one. And this is my first one and still got it.
I don't have a show and tell, but if anybody wants to talk about the Zenith off-center speaker, I'd be glad to speak about how that cone worked, because I designed cones had a cone company.
I'd really like to hear that.
Okay, well, first of all, that cone was designed to put the magnet off center. It really wasn't designed for acoustics. Oval cones all work pretty similar. The interesting thing about that cone is that the speaker still has a normal resonance because of the suspension, the mass, and the spider arrangement. But the cone breakup pattern being off center is very interesting. That becomes multiple resonance, which is a really good thing, because then you don't have one dominant resonance, you have a bunch of smaller ones. And that's what an oval speaker does, because you have a path length in one axis different from the other, where a round cone, it's spherical waves. And that probably, if you do it just right, it gives you a nice sound. It was also, I noticed, a curvilinear tone, which was surprising for AM radio, because normally for AM radio you use a straight cone, you want a rising response. But apparently, because of it being off center like that, it probably was stiff enough, so it gave you a rising response. That's why they use, if you look at typical AM radios that were made, they used straight wall cones that had steps in them, and the steps were used to lob off the high frequency response after about 6 kc, so you wouldn't get adjacent channel noise. Rather than using a capacitor, was actually built in as a mechanical filter. That cone did not incorporate it, but being off center like that, like I said, the path lanes in the vertical and horizontal axis are different, and that does break up your resonance pattern on the breakup pattern on the paper itself. But as far as the resonance of the speaker itself, still has the suspension and still has a resonance. That's just physics. You know, it's still a plate that's suspended. But It's interesting, but the main reason was for part component layouts, what they did, and to accommodate the magnet. I was involved in, not in that model because I'm not that old, but other similar devices. And the company I started in the cone business years ago, which was called Fiberform, had a lot of Zenith business. And when I started in acoustics, I actually worked with one of the head engineers from Zenith Radio, who went over to Motorola, and I worked at Motorola PA Ceramics for years, designing piezo speakers. But it's very interesting. It's a neat cone, very neat. Not many of those were made. They had a demonstration of a cone like that at the Museum of Science Industry years ago. I don't know if anybody ever went to the Hall of Acoustics there, but they actually showed an off-center cone like that, and then they showed the tone differences from it. This is back in the 60s. I'm sure it's long gone today. It was the hall with the reflectors. Remember that? You go one end of the hall and somebody's speaking of the plexiglass reflector, and on the other hall you could hear the person, and they showed off-center cones and demonstrated the resonances and how they sounded. And that's it. That's what I can tell you off the top of my head.
Okay, that concludes our meeting for today. Thank everyone for showing up and participating. It was a great meeting, and I hope to see you again next month.